Okay, I'm using a new install of Blender 2.5. If this is your very first time using Blender, I recommend you go read the manual, familiarize yourself with the very basics. Before I get started, I'm going to go make a change to user preferences for orbit style. That simply sets that when I use the middle mouse button, the ground remains flat instead of tilting. I'm also going to expand this area so we can see all the properties, including the physics. We're going to use the Blender game engine. So under the engine pull down, we're going to select game. Okay, let's turn this default box into a plank now. Go to object properties, name the object to plank. The exact dimensions I'm not sure, but what's important for these planks are the proportions. That's what makes these interesting building blocks. That's very large, so I'm going to scale that down. I'm going to press S, and I'm going to scale it down to about 5%, 0.05, enter. It's a good size. I'm going to go to the physics properties here and make this plank a rigid body. Rigid body simply means it's a solid that will be subject to forces like gravity and will collide with other solids. I recommend you always use collision bounds for rigid bodies, and in this case we're going to use the box. I'm going to turn off damping for our planks. This is like an artificial slowdown or air friction if you want. I'm also going to turn off the radius. It doesn't apply to the box. Reduce that as small as possible. Okay, let's see what we have now. If I go to game, start engine, the shortcut key for that is P while your cursor is in the viewport. So I'm going to press P, and the plank falls due to gravity. We basically built our plank now. So let's add a ground. You might be tempted to add a plane, but Blender doesn't implement a plane primitive for collision bounds, so I don't recommend that, because instead what you have a very thin solid through which objects could easily go through. So I'm going to delete the plane, and instead, pressing Shift A here, I'm going to add a cube for my ground. And I'm going to scale that up to about the size of the grid, and I'm going to make it flush with the grid by lowering it 1 unit. I call this ground, almost. I'm going to go to the Physics tab and make the ground static, but also set the collision bounds to box to make the collisions very precise. Static means the object will not move. So now if I press P to start the game engine, collision is detected and it pushes the plank out of the ground. Okay, let's start creating a structure with our plank. Before I get started here, I'm going to turn on the wire so that we can always see the outline of the plank. I'm also going to make my plank part of a group. This will help select the plank later when if I build multiple structures with them. Now this is not mandatory, but I like to apply my scale. This will come in handy later when we do texturing and UV mapping. And it can be useful for other shapes when doing physics. For the box it's not important, however, but I'm applying the scale in this case. To build our structure, we're going to snap to grid. So I'm going to turn on snap to grid here. You can use all sorts of snap to functions in Blender, but right now we're going to use the grid. The grid, however, is very large. So I'm going to go to properties here and scroll down, go to display, and reduce the scale of the grid to also 5% of what it is, so 0.05. Okay, now let's start building a structure. Since we have our plank set up with the group, we just need to duplicate what we have. So we can duplicate link or just duplicate. It's Alt-D and Shift-D. The only difference between these two is the first one, Alt-D, creates an instance, whereas the other one copies the entire object. I'll use the instance for now. So by default, your object is in grab mode or move mode. You can restrain movement by pressing Y to restrain against the Y-axis, X and Z to restrain movement against the different axes. Now we're going to do Y and just lay the planks side by side. So I'm going to be doing Alt D Y continually here as I lay down some planks next to each other. 5 planks makes a perfect square due to the proportions of these planks. Alt D, now I'm going to do Z to bring it up. Now I'm going to rotate that plank, that's R, along the x-axis for 90 degrees. And I'm going to move it over here, Alt D Y, Alt D Y. Just laying down some planks. Now I'm going to select these 4 planks, do Alt D Z. I'm going to rotate these by doing R for rotate, Z axis, 90, enter. So now I've rotated these. I'm going to go select using Shift and right mouse button again. All of these planks, Alt D, Z, move it up. And now we're starting to build a structure. Alt D, Z. That looks pretty good. Should we do one more? No, that's good enough. Let's do one more. Okay, now what we need on top here is a roof, and that's basically what I built on the bottom here. I'm going to use Shift and right mouse click to select those, and I'm just simply going to move them to the top, and that's going to be my roof. Okay, good. We have a structure now. I can select this structure easily by going to select grouped by group, since they're all part of a group. I can duplicate again, Alt D, along X now, for example, to make my structure even larger. And I can eliminate the redundancy in the middle here while deleting these planks. And we're going to move these planks to the right. There we go. We have a structure. If I press P now, we have a structure that doesn't fall down. Move the light over here just to get better lighting in the game engine. Move it up a bit. Now let's add an object to knock down our structure. So before I do that, I'm going to turn off or restore my grid size to 1, as all objects that are added relative to the grid. I'm going to Shift A, add a sphere, move that up here. That's very large. I'm going to scale it down 0, scale S 0.25, let's say. Okay, now I'm going to apply this scale. Control A. Go to the physics properties, make this also a rigid body, which means it's going to be moving. And for collision bounds, I'm going to use sphere here. I'm going to set the radius to my size 0.25. Let's press P, see what happens. The sphere falls to the ground. Now it doesn't bounce. The reason for that is you need to add a material if you want it to bounce. And under physics properties of material, you can add an elasticity property. You need to do that to all objects that are going to collide. Now that I've added elasticity to the ground and sphere, if I press P, now we see our sphere bounces off the ground. Okay, now let's make that sphere crash into our structure. To give some motion to our sphere, what we're going to do is we're going to go up to the game logic, and with our sphere selected, I'm going to just remove the properties here. We're going to add an actuator, which is a motion actuator, and we're going to give an instant linear velocity along the y-axis to our sphere. Let's say 10. But for this actuator to be triggered, we're going to have to add a sensor. We can use a keyboard key for that. Let's say Y. And we're going to add a controller to have this sensor linked to this actuator. Right now, there's only one sensor triggering one actuator, so we'll just take the default controller. Now, if I press P, and the moment I press Y, our sphere is going to have an instantaneous y linear velocity. Doesn't create much damage, our sphere. That's simply because the mass is equal to the planks. If we make the mass much larger, then it will create a lot more wreckage. Okay, if we want to spawn spheres out of thin air, what we need to do is take our sphere and move it to another layer. I'm going to move it to the second layer temporarily. And here I'm going to add an empty, which is basically a locator. I'm going to move it over here. Now for our empty, what we're going to do is we're going to do an edit object, add. It's going to add our sphere. And for this sensor, we're going to use the mouse, left mouse button with a default controller. And we're going to give a linear velocity to our sphere when it's launched. 7.5, that's good. Okay, so now when I press P, the moment I press my left mouse button, a sphere is generated. And you can generate as many spheres as you want. Okay, so we can keep going here. Okay, so I've added two keyboard controllers here for the keyboard A, keys E, A, and D, which are triggering simple motion along the x-axis to move our player left and right. Our player represented by the empty, or in fact here by a monkey head. So I'm going to press the P key, and now a D and A are moving my player back and forth while I still can shoot spheres. So there you have basic player movement using these simple controls. Okay, so you can continue to design a game using sensors and actuators, etc. What I've done here is I've created a bit of Python code to handle most of these things rather than building them graphically. So all keys, I've selected all keys, are now redirected into player keys here, which is a very simple piece of code. All it does is it looks for the first person shooter keys here, WSAD for movement, space key and C key to go up and down, and it adds and subtracts the motion force to our player, which is now a dynamic object based on whether the key is being pressed or released. For the mouse as well, all mouse movement has been redirected to player mouse. And all that does is apply rotation to our player based on the mouse movement. We can see, to demonstrate this, if I press P to start the game engine, we'll see that their player, represented by a monkey head here, is moving based on the mouse movements. Since it's a dynamic object, it can collide with our structure and interact with it. And now when we press our left mouse button, it will also launch a sphere. I'll just demonstrate here for the launcher. I've put it over its right shoulder, and for that's also being handled by code when the left mouse button is pressed. What I do is once it's pressed, I start a timer, and once it's released, I set the linear velocity in the Y direction, which is local, to the relative to how long the mouse was pressed, so I can demonstrate that. If I press very briefly on the mouse button, there's not much velocity added to the sphere. If I hold and let go, then there's a lot more velocity released on the sphere. Okay, now what I've also done is I've added a camera here to the player, which represents the eye. I'm going to remove the monkey here that represents the player. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate that when we start the game, the camera is set as our default camera or eye position. So now when I press P, now we are the player. So when I move around with my WASD key and up and down with space and C, I can actually interact with this thing. I am the player, and I can launch spheres and play inside the game.